Alright, New Year's resolution number 1. Do not troll the Investigator fans by creating another class ranking video and then putting Investigator in the last spot. So, what's the first video this year? Oh well, we all know that New Year's resolutions never get kept. Today, we are ranking every class and class archetype in Pathfinder 2nd Edition on this episode of the Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who enjoys chaos mechanics a little bit more than he probably should. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today I am doing a special New Year's video where I am going to be ranking every single class and class archetype in Pathfinder 2nd Edition and deciding ultimately which classes in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, at least at this moment, are in the best state for people to play. Ranking videos tend to be a lot of fun, and you get a lot of good conversation out of those videos, and a lot of good debate between me and the Investigator fans. I wanted to actually rank every single class in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. But then when I came up with that concept, I thought, no, wait, I really need to go big for my New Year's video, and then I decided to add not just classes, but class archetypes for Pathfinder 2e. Paizo has produced an incredible amount of content for Pathfinder 2e, and they have released a number of different classes, and with Guns and Gears and Secrets of Magic, they have also begun to release class archetypes as well. In fact, right now, as it stands, there are well over 30 different class and class archetypes available to players, meaning that there are a variety of options available for you if you're interested in playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition. But, in this variety of options, which options are the best? I'm sure this video will not be controversial at all. Oh well, angry comments feed the algorithm. But I didn't just want to do a simple ranking video. I actually wanted to dive deep into the classes and really consider what makes a class a strong choice at a gaming table. To that effect, with the help of several people on my Discord server, I came up with 4 categories that I used to rank all of the classes in Pathfinder 2e, and then after compiling my own rankings, I actually reached out to the Disaster Tour Guide community and asked for your votes and your thoughts on all of the classes in these various categories. And I took all of that data, lumped it together. I'm not going to pretend this is super scientific, but I did find some interesting observations along the way, and I think that this will offer an interesting insight into where Pathfinder 2nd Edition is as a game at this point in time, and possibly even offer some insight into some places that Paizo might go in order to strengthen Pathfinder 2e. So before I dive into the actual class rankings, I want to take a minute and talk about what I'm ranking and how I'm ranking them. But I do realize that this is a long video, and many of you all are just here to hear my thoughts on how the classes compare. So if you would like to jump ahead to that conversation, you can go to about this point in the video, and that should be where the actual rankings begin, or you can check out the timestamps that are in the video description. That should also give you very quick access to my actual thoughts on how the classes are ranked. So first up, what am I ranking today? Well, my goal is to rank every class and every class archetype separately to see how they compare to one another. Paizo has started producing class archetypes that modify how different classes play, and in some instances those archetypes make major changes to how a class plays or what role it fills inside of the game. And so instead of looking at all of the archetypes of a class together with the base class, I want to break everything out and look at them separately and see how they compare to one another. Now, what I am not ranking in this video is subclasses. Mostly because that would take too long. So in this video, I'm going to be looking at classes and class archetypes. There are a few exceptions, however, that I want to go ahead and discuss here. First off, there are actually two subclasses that I am going to be discussing, and that is the Warpriest Cleric versus the Cloistered Cleric. I feel like the Warpriest and the Cloistered Cleric play very differently and offer a different experience at the gaming table, so I want to look at those two separately because I consider the differences between them to be significant enough that you want to think about it when you're choosing your character. Also, there is one archetype that I am not going to be examining separate from the base class, and that is the Spellshot archetype for the Gunslinger. The Gunslinger subclasses are referred to as ways, and if I'm being honest, the Spellshot archetype for the Gunslinger feels more like a way plus than a true archetype. So I'm going to be looking at the Gunslinger and the Spellshot together because I don't think the Spellshot is different enough to truly warrant a full evaluation on its own. And now for an even more important question, we need to ask, how am I ranking the classes in today's video? So what I did in ranking all of these different classes and archetypes is I broke them into 4 different categories and evaluated them in each category on a scale of 1 to 10, and then I totaled the score from each category to create an overall score out of 40. Now, my reason for doing this is pretty simple. Not every player is looking for the same thing. Some players may enjoy a certain playstyle or a certain type of character, and other players may find that particular playstyle or that particular type of character to be something very unappealing to them. I have admitted on this channel that over my years as a gamer, I have grown very averse to the concept of the rogue. It's just not a playstyle that appeals to me very much. So I personally would not be inclined to evaluate a rogue very strongly, whereas another player who enjoys that playstyle would probably evaluate that playstyle rather highly because it is something that they enjoy. We all enjoy different things at the gaming table, and so I think it's important when we evaluate classes and what they offer at the gaming table that we look at them through a variety of lenses to really see what they have to offer. To that effect, there is a very real possibility that I may evaluate a class poorly that you would evaluate very highly, and that is probably because of differences in the playstyle that you and I have, and honestly that's okay. With the advice and insight of my fantastic Discord community, I came up with 4 different categories to evaluate each of the classes and archetypes in Pathfinder 2e. Combat role, social mechanics and role-playing hooks, the class feel or class fantasy, and finally, the longevity and company support that has been given to a particular class. Let's talk about what each of these means really quickly. The easiest to define is the first one, which is combat role. When this character is engaged in combat, what role should they play, and then how effectively do they play that role? This first category asks the question, does a class clearly direct you towards a particular role, and then does the class fill that role well inside of the game? The second category is social mechanics and role-playing hooks. Now, let me just say up front, I realize any class in the hands of a good role player can be a fantastic character. A lot of the social RP portion of a character is up to the person playing that character, but it is still worth noting that if you value the social game or the roleplay heavily, it is nice to have a character class that is designed for that aspect of the game. Now, for the third category that I'm going to be discussing, I will admit this is where it starts to get a little bit vaguer, but at the same time, I still feel like this is an important concept, and that's what I call the class feel or class fantasy. There is a difference between mechanically powerful and mechanically interesting. When we play a game, we want to feel like we are inhabiting whatever character it is that we are portraying. Do the mechanics support the fantasy of that particular class, or do they leave you feeling detached from the character? The final category that I came up with is actually kind of two different questions lumped together, but I call this category longevity and support. Longevity is simply a question of how well does a class play over the course of a long campaign. This is probably one of those categories that is more important to me than it might be to other gamers. I have had the blessing of playing a lot of campaigns level 1 to level 20. I have finished a lot of true full campaigns, and so for me, the experience of playing a class at level 20 is just as important as the experience of playing a class at level 10, level 5, or even level 1. I want the class to be interesting and engaging throughout the entire scope of play, not just in certain bands of play. And as an extension of that topic, one of the questions that is worth asking is, how well is the class supported by the company that wrote it? It's not just enough for a company to put out a class, but it's important that the company continue to support that class so that it doesn't feel like that class is falling behind relative to other classes in the game. Now, longevity and support are two different concepts, but as a general rule, what I have noticed is a class that is well supported by the company tends to be a class that has a lot of longevity inside of a game. They seem to correlate to each other, so I have stuck them together for this last category. Now, there was an additional fifth category that I was considering, which is fun factor and public voting. Now, when it came to the public voting, I actually gave bonus points to some of the classes for getting the most votes in each category, or the most votes overall compared to other classes. I also allowed public comments and public insights to affect how I might rank classes that achieved the same score overall. And then, if I still couldn't decide how to break a tie, I just asked myself, which one do I think is the most fun? So that's how I scored everything in this particular list. Now, really quick, let me give you some caveats and some insights that I have seen that don't fit anywhere else in this video. First off, obviously, this list is still very highly subjective. I've done my best to categorize my thoughts. I've done my best to carefully analyze each class according to the categories I've established, but everything in this list is still subjective, and I fully understand that there are going to be people who disagree with my assessment of different classes or where they might fall on each of the scales. And by the way, I love the feedback this community gives me, so if you disagree, let me know down in the comments. Be a part of the conversation. That's why I started this channel to begin with. Also, to give everyone an idea of how I did my analysis, my starting point for every class in every category was 5. 5 is average. If the class is doing the baseline, if the class is doing the basics that I think need to be done, it gets a 5. A score above a 5 is a reflection of the fact that Paizo has gone above and beyond and done more than I expected them to do for that class or that archetype in that given category. By the same token, if a class has a score below a 5, that means that Paizo has, in one fashion or another, failed to live up to some of the expectations that I have, again, for that class or archetype in that given category. The ratings tend to favor more established classes over newer classes, and tends to favor the base version of a class over a class archetype. Now, there are some notable exceptions to those patterns, and we'll talk about them as they come up, but as we're going through this list, you may see that these scores tend to reflect that particular distribution. I think it is fair to expect that more established material be more accessible and more usable for the typical player. Also, I would just like to say this. I appreciate everyone who voted and offered feedback. It was very interesting to me the variety of responses that I got. One of the interesting things is almost every class got a vote somewhere in this list. There is only one class that did not get any votes in any category, and there are only two classes that got runner-up votes in some categories. Every other class got a vote somewhere in this system that I established, and I think that is a testimony to how well designed a lot of these Paizo classes are, which means the final caveat I have for you is I think the majority of the stuff Paizo has put out is really good. There's some stuff I'm not a big fan of, but overall, the quality of these classes is really high, and I think almost every class or archetype in the game has something to offer. Whew! Have I got all the setup out of the way? Actually, no, there's just one more quick thing. Do all the YouTube stuff. If you enjoy the video, like it, share it, subscribe to the channel, leave comments, be part of the conversation, help support this community. I appreciate you all so much. My Discord community was a big part of making this video possible. If you'd like to join, check out the link in the video description. Also, I do have a Patreon, and if you would like to support this channel financially, you can check out that link in the video description as well. Alright, now we can go. Let's get started. So let's start off at the bottom of my list, and let's talk about the only two classes on this list that I personally would not recommend trying unless you just really want a challenging class to play. Number 40 on my list is the Wellspring Summoner, whereas number 39 on my list is the Ecclesiasts Warpriest, which is an archetyped version of the Cleric. Ecclesiast is the recommended name that they give to the flexible caster archetype, which can be applied to the Cleric, and then Warpriest is one of the two subclasses that the Cleric offers, so the Ecclesiast Warpriest, or essentially military chaplain if you will, is that particular combination. Both of these classes rank pretty low. The Wellspring Summoner has an overall score of 16 out of 40, and the Ecclesiast Warpriest comes in with a slightly higher score of 19 out of 40. And let me be honest, I feel like both of these classes have the same problem. The Wellspring Caster archetype, the Flexible Caster archetype, both of these are intended to take classes that use magic and you sacrifice some spell slots to change the way that you use magic. So both of these archetypes are intended to be very magic-focused archetypes. And in both of these cases, they are being applied to classes where a heavy magical focus is not the best description of what the class is intended to be. The Summoner uses a special spell progression that I've seen some people refer to as wave casting, but essentially with the Summoner, you don't have very many spells to begin with, and then you're giving some of them up so you can do special things with the few spell slots that remain. It doesn't feel like a good trade to me. The Ecclesiast Warpriest does a little bit better because it does have a full spellcasting progression, but the Warpriest trades off some of its proficiency in spellcasting for additional armor proficiencies, weapon proficiencies, and things like that. So the Warpriest, while it is intended to be a caster class, doesn't come with the kind of heavy spellcasting focus that I think you truly need to get the mileage out of slapping the flexible casting archetype on it. Both of these options are asking you to trade off what little spellcasting you have to make the remaining limited spellcasting more interesting. It's not a good exchange if you ask me. Now, the Wellspring Summoner, I don't know if it can be saved. This is an archetype I would have to see some really crazy support for before I would be interested in diving into this class. The Ecclesiast Warpriest Cleric is borderline for me. As it stands, I would not play one, but with a little more support for the Warpriest subclass, or some expansion of options available to the Flexible Caster archetype, I could see this class becoming playable. A little more support could push it over the edge for me, But as it stands right now, Wellspring Summoner, Ecclesiasts Warpriest, I just can't recommend either of these two classes. Everything else on this list I do think is playable, but these two, I'm not happy with where they stand. At number 38 on my list, we're going to be taking a look at one of the recent playtest classes that can potentially be combined with one of the archetypes from Secrets of Magic. That is the Wellspring Psychic. There are a lot of things holding the Wellspring Psychic back, not the least of which is that as of the recording of this video, we have only seen the playtest version of the Psychic. We have not seen the final version of that class. Definitely keep that in mind with everything I'm about to say. But the Psychic has fewer spells per level than a traditional caster class, and the Wellspring archetype requires the Psychic to functionally give up some of their spells. And for me, that is a really, really heavy cost to pay. From my playtest experiences with the Psychic, it's already a difficult class to play effectively, and then you add this extra burden of sacrificing spell slots on top of that. I would only recommend this combination for very experienced players who really want to challenge themselves. But what makes this class playable for me is the flavor of these two combinations. I love the flavor of the Psychic class, but the chaotic overflowing of magic that comes with the Wellspring archetype, it is a perfect fit for the Psychic. As things currently stand, I don't know if it is worth it to play a Psychic with the Wellspring archetype, and I'm interested to see what the final version of the Psychic looks like, because if I could slap the Wellspring archetype onto the Psychic and still have an effective character, the role-playing and story potential there is amazing. But for now, it's just too challenging of a combination, so number 38 on my list. Coming in at number 37 on my list is a class that is probably not going to surprise regular viewers of this channel, and that is the Warpriest Cleric. The standard version of the Warpriest that comes with the core rulebook of Pathfinder 2e is a class that is something of a letdown for me. And I think that this is a really good example of why longevity in a class is so important. The Warpriest Cleric at low levels I think is extremely playable and extremely fun. Levels 1 through 10, I would not hesitate to play a Warpriest, but if I knew that a campaign was definitely going to go above level 10, it's a class that I would not be very interested in playing because I feel like the viability of the class really drops off after level 10. You cap at Master Proficiency in Spellcasting so you don't get the Legendary Spellcasting, and you also cap at Expert Proficiency with Weapons and Armor. The high level potential is just not there for me, but I will admit, for low-level characters, one-shot games, for an introductory character, I think that the standard Warpriest Cleric is very playable, and I do appreciate its inclusion in the game. I just wish that Paizo did a little bit more to support this class and make it more engaging, because as is, it drops off too much for me. So at number 36, let's talk about the base version of the Psychic that was in the most recent playtest. Now let me go ahead and say that the Psychic is the only class that did not receive any votes during the public voting. The Thaumaturge actually got some public votes, but the Psychic, I think, is more hindered by the fact that, as of right now, it is only a playtest class. I can also say that from my experience playtesting the Psychic, that it was challenging. I had a lot of fun playing the Psychic, and I feel like the storytelling potential with the Psychic is really good. Paizo has found a deep well of potential story material with this class, but I do feel like the class is in a rough state, at least from the playtest. Now, I do have a lot of hope for the Psychic going forward. Paizo has a good record of listening to playtest feedback and really seeing what they can do to respond to the concerns and criticisms that people have. And I do think the final published version of the Psychic is going to be very solid. I could see this class moving up this list very easily. But right now, I feel like it's kind of challenging. It's not super accessible, especially to new players. And I feel like those things held it back. And I think that's reflected in the fact that it's the only class that got no votes whatsoever in public voting. Coming in at number 35 is the Feycaller. Now, Feycaller is the suggested name that Paizo gives the Druid class when you apply the flexible spellcaster archetype to it from Secrets of Magic. The overall score here is 24 out of 40, and the premise here is that the Druid in question has been influenced by the magic of the Fey, causing them to use their spells differently from your standard Druid. There's certainly some storyline potential here, and I do think this class archetype offers some interesting options, but overall I feel like this is a weak combination, and overall I think that the Feycaller serves as an illustration of why archetypes tended to struggle in this particular ranking video. There are two basic problems here. First, the flexible spellcasting archetype requires that the Druid sacrifice a spell slot of each level in order to gain the benefits of this particular archetype. Now, some classes actually come with ways to offset that loss. And so, yes, you're giving up some spells, but you don't feel that loss nearly as much, and you get the added flexibility that comes from the archetype. The Druid doesn't have that. And so, the lost spells hurt more here. I don't think it's unplayable, but I do think it's challenging, and probably the Feycaller Druid is best left to experienced role players who want a more challenging combination. The second issue that I have with this archetype is, well, I'm not sure if I like the flavor. This is a common problem with the archetypes. Paizo gives us the option to change up what we do with the classes, which is cool, but then doesn't always deliver a narrative way to include those new options. Now, in the Feycaller Druid's favor, they did give us the Feycaller title for this particular class and archetype combination, but the thing is, when I think Feycaller, when I think of the Fey, I think of enchantment and illusion magic. I don't think of flexible spell preparation. Yes, it's a small and pedantic consideration, but the offered flavor doesn't line up with the mechanical style of play here. This is a case of class feel really suffering under the weight of the attempt to offer unique mechanical options. I still think you can do some interesting things here, but overall I'm not the biggest fan of combining Druid with flexible spellcasting. The Feycaller only gets a 24 out of 40 for me. Alright, I've been holding out long enough. It's time to spark the internet fight. At number 34, we have the Investigator. The Investigator comes with an overall score of 24.5 out of 40. And I will go ahead and give the Investigator the credit that is due. It got a ton of support in public voting on both my Discord and YouTube channel. It was second for class feel and fantasy. The reality is, my viewing public loves the role-playing style of the Investigator class. And despite my famous criticisms of the Investigator, I will say I think it deserves some credit in those two categories. I do think there's a ton of role-playing potential. I do think the mechanics of the class line up really well with the class feel or fantasy that you associate with an Investigator. I think it does both of those things reasonably well, and I even think it's pretty solid in the combat role department. In fact, really for me, the main problem with the Investigator in Pathfinder 2e is I don't play Pathfinder when I want to play an Investigator-style character. There are certainly games, such as Call of Cthulhu, where I love Investigator-style characters. That's the point, the purpose of the game. But when I think about a long, overarching level 1 to level 20 fantasy campaign, the Investigator is just not for me. I feel like this is one of those classes that is really good in one-shots, short story arcs, and other limited game formats, but it just doesn't have the staying power to hold my interest long term, and that's what causes the Investigator to sink a little bit for me. There's a few other issues here. One, the Investigator feels like a weak rogue to me. It gets lots of skills and skill feats, but unlike the rogue, it can't use any skill or any skill feat, but rather limits its selections to mental stat skills or skill feats. And then the other concern that I have for the Investigator, it is something of a mad, multiple attribute dependent class, and I think that holds it back just a little bit as well. Again, overall, I understand the respect the Investigator gets, and in the right game, I'll play one. But for a long campaign, I'm going to be looking for something else. Now coming in at number 33, we have the Elementalist Summoner. Elementalist is one of the class archetypes, and this particular archetype allows you to switch out your normal spell list for a special elemental spell list instead. So basically it changes which spells you have access to with your class. Now, Elementalist can only be applied to classes that have the arcane or primal spell list, which means that only some versions of the Summoner can actually use the Elementalist archetype. That, in fact, is one of the reasons that I think the Elementalist Summoner ultimately ranks lower on this list, is because effectively with the Elementalist Summoner what you are doing is cutting your options for Eidolons in half. If you're using an Eidolon from the Arcane or Primal tradition, then you have access to this option, but Divine and Occult Eidolons, you can't use those. And if you wanted to dig a little bit deeper, you might even ask the question, does the Elementalist archetype work well with all of the Arcane and Primal Eidolons? That could be up in the air as well. Now, that being said, the Elementalist Summoner feels like the most Final Fantasy Summoner of the different Summoner variants available in this game, and that gives me some respect for this. My favorite character in Final Fantasy IV was Rydia, and I would absolutely love to bring some of those elemental blast summon spells back into one of my games. I certainly think there are some fun options here. I will say this of the Elementalist Summoner though, I feel like this is a high-risk, high-reward playstyle. The Summoner doesn't have a lot of spell slots, and the Elementalist kind of pushes you in the direction of Blaster Caster. However, you're a Blaster Caster who doesn't have that many spell slots overall, and that means that a poorly placed spell or a good saving throw from your enemies could be a lot more impactful for this particular character. Now, I do think the Elementalist Summoner still has the potential to be very effective, has the potential to be a lot of fun, so if you enjoy high risk, high reward, this could be a good class for you. But if you're worried about a high risk, high reward playstyle, this might be a class I would caution you against. The last thing I want to say really quick about the Elementalist Summoner, we'll get into this more when we talk about the main variation of the Summoner, but I do feel like there's a little bit of a social imbalance in the way the game presents the Summoner and their Eidolon. And I think the Elementalist Summoner actually does the best job of restoring the balance between those two characters. So I do think there's some nice niche benefit in the RP department for this particular combination. In fact, while we're talking about the Elementalist, let's go ahead and talk about numbers 32, 31, and 30 on my list, which are in order the Elementalist Wizard with an overall score of 25 out of 40, the Elementalist Sorcerer with an overall score of 26 out of 40, and the Elementalist Magus with an overall score of 26 out of 40 as well. All three of these have kind of the same situation that we had with the Summoner. The Elementalist archetype comes in and modifies which spells the class has access to. So the Wizard trades out the Arcane spell list and instead uses the Elemental spell list. The Sorcerer trades out whatever spell list they might get from their bloodline and instead trades it for the Elemental spell list, and The same for the Magus, they switch Arcane for Elemental. Now, the Wizard suffers the most here because the main strength of the Arcane spell list is the size of the Arcane spell list. It is the largest spell list in the game, and that is a purposeful design decision by Paizo. So, the switch from the Arcane list to the Elemental list really cuts down the number of options that the Wizard has access to, undercutting one of the main strengths of the class. Also, Elementalist Wizard kinda runs against the scholarly theme that they have put on the Wizard class in Pathfinder 2e, so it kind of undercuts some of the role-playing options that Paizo put in there. Overall, the Elementalist Wizard just kind of feels like a tournament or one-shot character for me. Lots of fun in short bursts, but not something I'm going to invest heavily in over the course of a long campaign. The Elementalist Sorcerer kind of has the same restrictions that we talked about on the Summoner in that only some options for the class can actually use Elementalist. You need a bloodline that either has arcane or primal spells. And basically, you just take whatever that spell list is, switch it over to Elementalist, and congratulations, almost all of the transformation is complete. Honestly, there's not a lot to say here other than the Elementalist Sorcerer kind of feels like a slightly reskinned Druid to me. I don't hate it, but I kind of feel like if I wanted that playstyle, I would play a Druid instead. It's not a bad option, they're just options I feel like I like more. In this set, my favorite Elementalist is the Elementalist Magus. And pretty much the reason I enjoy this the most here is because I feel like the Magus loses the least by switching out its spell slots. Magus is a much more combat-oriented class, so switching out Arcane for Elementalist doesn't do as much here. You go from pretty much a blaster caster to still pretty much a blaster caster, so that's not a huge change. I feel like it's much more on theme for the Magus. And overall, I feel like that just better supports the Elementalist playstyle. You don't lose much, but if you enjoy the elemental options, you gain all of those. So next up, we have number 29 on my list, and this is one that I feel like I probably am overrating compared to how other people might rate it. That is the Wellspring Archetype Sorcerer. So the theme behind Wellspring magic is that you sacrifice spell slots to gain the ability to spontaneously refresh spell slots at different points throughout your adventure. Basically, when danger strikes, you might suddenly find that you have access to spells again, even though you have previously cast them. It is ultimately a very chaotic playstyle, and I'm just going to be honest, I love chaos. And truthfully, for the sorcerer, the person who is controlling magic through their blood, through their force of personality, that chaotic implication of the archetype is a really fantastic match of mechanics to flavor and really nails the class fantasy for me. So I genuinely love the Wellspring Sorcerer. I will say that this is probably one of those classes that if you don't enjoy some chaos to your playstyle, you probably don't want to try this out. But if you like to live on the wild side like I do, this is a fun choice. I also think this is a good point to go ahead and add in another element that comes to these class archetypes that I feel is worth discussion. Most of the class archetypes in Secret of Magic only give you 1 or 2 pages. It's not a ton of material. It's just a quick, here are the things that change, here are a few feats to support this archetype, and there's not much else. And I kind of get the feeling that there's not going to be a lot of support for these archetypes going forward. It's some quick suggestions that you can use to modify classes, and not something we're going to see as an ongoing part of Paizo's products, which disappoints me a little bit. I would love to see some expanded options for the Wellspring archetype and for some of the other archetypes we're talking about in this video. I truly hope Paizo isn't just going to leave us with the little bit that they gave us in Secrets of Magic. Up next, at number 28, we have the Cloistered Ecclesiast, or the flexible spellcasting variant of the Cleric, being applied to the Cloistered Cleric subclass. The Cloistered Cleric subclass is the magic and casting focused version of the Cleric in Pathfinder 2e, so I do feel like the Cloistered Cleric is a much better match for the flexible spellcasting archetype, for the Ecclesiast build, if you will. I think they go together much better. In fact, if you are interested specifically in the flexible spellcasting variant that is in Secrets of Magic, I actually think that the Cloistered Cleric is the best option to put the flexible spellcasting archetype on. You may remember that I mentioned that flexible spellcasting requires you to sacrifice spell slots throughout your character progression. Well, the Cleric comes with the Divine Font feature, which is basically free spells of your highest spell level that you get to use every single day. Yes, it's specifically for heal or harm, but basically, your most powerful and most important spell, you have multiple uses of that are completely unaffected by the loss that comes with the flexible spellcasting archetype. You have guaranteed uses of your most important spell always ready to go, and then the flexible spellcasting archetype allows you to be creative with how you use the remaining spells that your character can access. Now, the Cloistered Ecclesiast does have all of the issues with clerics that I have mentioned in this video and other videos, and that does hold back this combination some, but this is probably a perfect option for combining a caster class with the flexible spellcasting archetype. And now we move to number 27 on my list, which comes in with a score of 27 out of 40. I swear I didn't plan that. I'll go ahead and tell you, we are now at the portion of the list where the difference between classes gets much, much narrower, and there is a lot more Mark's fun factor in which class takes which spot. I'll be honest, I struggled in determining exactly where I wanted to put a lot of the classes that are coming up on this list. We are definitely in kind of that main pack of classes that are all very close to each other in terms of overall playability. And at number 27, we have the Elementalist Druid. And I kind of hate to say it here, I don't have a lot to say. The Elementalist Druid basically feels like the regular Druid. It has a slightly smaller spell list, but most of what you give up are some of the Druid's more complex and difficult to use spells. So, in a way, you're just kind of using the spells that would have already been easier to use, and not much else really changes. There are very minor RP implications here, Elemental Fury is kind of a thing, but overall I feel like the Elementalist Druid is a Druid with a slightly narrower focus than the core Druid. It's not bad, it just doesn't bring anything new to the table. Coming in at number 6, also with a score of 27 out of 40, is the Standard Oracle in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Now, let me go ahead and say that probably the biggest hindrance to playing the Oracle is the overall complexity of the class. The way that curses and mysteries work, and the unique progression that the Oracle has to deal with that other classes don't really have to concern themselves about, that can be a hurdle if you want to play the Standard Oracle in Pathfinder 2e. I have seen some relatively new players manage to play the Oracle and do alright with the class, but I do think it has a learning curve that other classes don't, so that is one of the downsides for the Oracle that may have pushed it a little bit lower on this list, but the positives for the Oracle is the incredible role-playing hooks that come with the design of the class. And I think this is a point where a lot of you all would agree with me, because in the public voting on the classes, Oracle performed extremely well in the role-playing vote. The design of the curses and the mysteries is a fuel for so many types of stories, and I think a lot of people see the very natural hooks that you can sink your teeth into as a gamer. You can get a lot of story mileage out of the design of this class, And I think that helps create a natural excitement that allows you to manage some of the clunkier mechanical elements that the Oracle brings to the table. Now, I will say this, Oracle suffers from the problem of it was published in the Advanced Player's Guide, and we haven't gotten any other subclass options for the Oracle. I heard a rumor the other day that they are including a time mystery for the Oracle in the upcoming Dark Archives book next year. I have not been able to confirm that, so don't know if it's true or not. But if that's true, that is several major publications that have happened before the Oracle finally receives one more subclass option. And overall, it does kind of leave the impression that Paizo has kind of set the Oracle by the wayside. I would like to see the Oracle get some more support going forward. So at number 25, also coming in with an average score of 27 out of 40, is the standard version of the Cloistered Cleric in Pathfinder 2e. And I think there are some interesting things at play in how this class performed in this particular ranking. Cleric is a class that has been somewhat of a disappointment for me. In Pathfinder 1st Edition and in the various editions of Dungeons & Dragons that I've played, I got very used to very strong cleric domains. It was one of the ways that clerics used to differentiate themselves with different clerics of the same deity, focusing on different domains to really highlight the differences that might occur inside of churches in the setting. The domains in Pathfinder 2nd Edition just lack the depth that I saw in previous editions of this game. Now a domain is 2 focus spells, and as a Cloistered Cleric, you might only get one of them. You might not even take the second. It just falls flat for me. Which is interesting because Cleric got the second highest number of votes in the Social Hooks role-playing category when I was asking for feedback from the public. For me, the storytelling side of clerics is hindered, but for a lot of people, the storytelling side of clerics is very strong. And I think I know what's going on here. The Golarion setting is extremely well written, and the religions inside of the Golarion setting are very engaging. I do really appreciate the setting writing, and I do think that the clerics in Pathfinder benefit from the setting writing. Ergo, books like Lost Omens, Gods and Magic are very strong books, and they add a lot to the game. What I think is going on here is other people are not as weighed down by cleric domains as I am personally, and that may just be what's causing me to not appreciate the class as much as others do. But I will say this, moving the cleric from an armored warrior with some magic to this spellcasting focused character. It has very white mage Final Fantasy vibes to it, and I love that aspect. I think that was a good design change. And I have mentioned previously in this video, the Divine Font is incredibly powerful. So as a cleric, you're going to be good at your job. So I do think that Cloistered Cleric is a very solid option, and that you're going to have some fun at the gaming table if you play one. I just wish I could get over my own mental hurdle about how they handled domains in this edition, because it is truly one of the things that I just don't enjoy. Continuing with classes that have an overall score of 27 out of 40, number 24 on my list is the Swashbuckler. Longtime fans of the channel might know that my initial impression of the Swashbuckler was really negative, and this is one class where I really have to say thank you to the Disaster Tour Guide community, because you all opened my eyes to the fact my initial reading of this class was completely wrong. And when you pointed out where I was messing up, it really gave me an appreciation for the Swashbuckler. And I now realize this class has a much stronger design and appeals to my playstyle a lot more effectively. One of the most interesting things for me with the Swashbuckler is I feel like of the Advanced Player Guide classes, this class is probably the easiest class to use in play. The Oracle, the Witch, even the Investigator, there's some complexity about how to get the most out of those classes, but the Swashbuckler is a class that I honestly feel like you could hand to a beginner player and they would very quickly figure out this is how to use the class. I think Panache is very easy to grasp, even if I misread it the first time. And I feel like the way Panache interacts with the different subclasses works really well. Overall, I think this is a very accessible class, a very solid class. I personally just don't like the trope of dexterity as a god stat, and that hinders the Swashbuckler just a little bit in my mind, but overall I have to admit this class is easy to play, it's fun to play, it's very effective, and I can definitely see why it compares so well to other classes inside the game. Moving on, number 23, one of the newest classes in Pathfinder 2e, the Inventor, again with an overall score of 27 out of 40. I'll go ahead and tell you that the Inventor got a small but noticeable amount of support in the role-playing category when I did public voting for this video, and I do think that the Inventor highlights how you can design mechanics to maximize role-playing in combat. It's easy to think of combat and RP as two separate parts of a game, but you can have a lot of good role-playing inside of a combat encounter, and the Inventor is one of those classes that I think highlights how those two things can overlap really well. One of their fun combat feats is called "You Failed to Account for This!" And then there's my personal favorite ability, Explode. The flavor of how this class plays and the way I could see this character acting and reacting to a combat scene is so well done, and I do think it's a credit to this class that it compares so well to other classes inside the game. Now, there's only been one book for the Inventor so far, Guns and Gears. It hasn't been out long, so we don't know what type of support that it's going to see in the future. I definitely like where it started, and I can't wait to see where it goes, but I will say this, Paizo, when it comes to the Inventor, I do have one big gripe, and that is the armor innovation. The armor innovation makes you think that you're going to be a tank. And when it comes to personal protection, the armor-focused Inventor is great. But the armor-focused Inventor does not come with any kind of abilities that makes them good at protecting their team, and that's a big disappointment if your goal is to actually play the tank. I'm not saying that the armorer needs to be on par with the champion when it comes to tanking, but I will say in terms of class feel and overall effectiveness that the weapon Inventor and the construct Inventor feel a lot better, and the armor Inventor leaves me wanting more. Next up we have number 22 on the list, which is the standard version of the Summoner. This is found in Secrets of Magic, and it has an overall score of 27 out of 40, and honestly, there is a ton of good stuff I could say here. The versatility in Eidolons and the amount of creativity that you have as a player in designing this unique creature that serves you is phenomenal. I love the Summoner, and you can come up with some crazy combinations with this class. I think that Paizo did a really good job nailing the class flavor, the feel, the social RP. There is a ton of storyline hooks in the Summoner's Eidolon, and I think it brings a lot to the table. I really only have two criticisms of the Summoner class that hold it back a little bit. First, I'll go with the minor criticism, which is, why can't I have an Aberration Eidolon? In Pathfinder 1st Edition, my very first Eidolon was an Aberration, and I want to create an Aberration Eidolon for Pathfinder 2e as well. It would use the occult tradition. Come on, let me do it. Other than that, I love the options that are available. The larger issue I have is the balance of the class design. I mentioned this a little earlier with the Elementalist Summoner, but when it comes to the Summoner and the Eidolon, so much of the class is weighted towards the Eidolon that the Summoner ends up feeling like it's not your main character. And that's a problem for me. I love the Eidolon, but I wish that there were mechanics or options or feats or something to the Summoner class where your actual character doesn't feel like a hype man for the monster that you're bringing into battle. Overall, a solid class, but I would like to see a better balance between those two aspects of the class. At number 21 on this list, we have the class that is the most heartbreaking for me. I'm gonna be honest, I was not happy where this class landed. It's the Alchemist. If you have seen some of my other videos, you know that I like the Alchemist. It's one of my top tier classes. If we were going solely on, does Mark enjoy this? Alchemist would easily be top 4 or 5. But at the moment, the Alchemist is sitting at number 21, overall score of 27 out of 40. And if you look at the breakdown of the scores that I have on the screen, you may see that the Alchemist is kind of a tale of extremes. It is my 10 out of 10 in the class feel or class fantasy category. The fact that alchemy has been completely removed from magic that it was a part of in first edition, I love that. Alchemy is not a magic, it's a science. And alchemy is separate from the Inventor. You don't have it as an offshoot of the Artificer like you have in D&D 5e. Alchemy is its own unique field that brings its own unique options to the table, and I love that. That is easily the best thing Paizo did for the Alchemist. And honestly, this video would be way too long if I keep going down this road. But this is a class that has excellent item support. This is a class that has overall good subclasses. I even saw pretty common support for the Alchemist in public voting. It got votes in a lot of different areas. It wasn't the strongest overall, but it did seem like my community sees the value of the Alchemist class. I think the problem with the Alchemist is execution. I think Paizo had some great ideas here, and I've latched onto those ideas so much that I don't want to acknowledge the weaker portions of the class. The reality is, the Alchemist is the class that has needed the most errata, it's needed the heaviest errata, and of the classes in the core rulebook, it's the one that was in the weakest state when the book was first published. Paizo even drug their feet on support products for alchemy, like the Alchemical Items deck. I've been wanting one of those since the core rulebook released, and as of the recording of this video, it's still going to be a little while before I get to order one. Also, Alchemist is a mad class, like I've mentioned before, multiple attribute dependent. You need multiple high attribute scores for the class to be effective, which can lead to some difficulties in playing an Alchemist well. All of these things taken together, I think Paizo had some good ideas, but I feel like the execution could have been better, and ultimately, it holds back one of my favorite classes from truly being top tier when it comes to Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Okay, welcome to the very middle of this list, number 20, the Magus. The Magus overall has 27 points out of 40, and just to be clear, we're talking about the standard version from Secrets of Magic, no archetypes here. The Magus is just really solid. It is mechanically effective, it's terrifying when it lands a crit with a spell strike, and I want to give compliments to Paizo. Overall, the Magus feels reasonably balanced within the system. In Pathfinder 1st Edition, I had a couple of players who liked to play the Magus, mostly because the damage output was just way too broken and they knew how to tweak the builds to get that broken damage output. In 1st Edition, the Magus often frustrated me. I felt like it overshadowed a lot of other classes. The Pathfinder 2e Magus, however, I feel like blends martial and magic combat without overshadowing the other classes inside of the game. I feel like it is very mechanically solid. It is a very strong class without being too strong. And overall, I think that the Magus is going to do really well in this particular game. One of the downsides of the Magus is it focuses on fighting and throwing spells in the middle of a fight. There's a lot of fighting going on here and not a lot of RP. Role-playing is kind of a weakness for this class, and there's a little bit of a downside when it comes to the social game. So if you're looking for the social aspects of the game, this may not be the best fit for you. But overall, I think the class is very mechanically interesting and engaging. I will say this on the Magus, and I want you to keep this in mind for later. Earlier, I mentioned that there were only 2 classes that received runner-up votes when I did public voting. Magus is one of them, and it shares a trait with the other class that only received runner-up votes. But we'll talk about that when we get there. Let's keep going. Moving into the top half of the list, at number 19, we have the return of Chaos Magic with the Wellspring Archetype Oracle. The Wellspring Oracle has an overall score of 27 out of 40, and you may remember when I talked about the Wellspring Sorcerer that I mentioned that I love chaos mechanics inside of games. I am very willing to add randomness and craziness and who knows what the dice is going to do to my stories. I realize not every player has that particular personality quirk. I enjoy the Wellspring Sorcerer. I love the Wellspring Oracle. Seriously. The premise behind the Oracle is that your character has gained access to divine magic, but because they didn't gain access the right way, they don't quite have control of that divine magic like they should. The Wellspring archetype is the perfect fit for this concept. Seriously. You access divine magic, you didn't do it the right way, you don't have the right control, and so that means you don't necessarily know when or if you're going to get your spells. I love this. It is amazing to me. This is my 10 out of 10 score for the social role-playing side of a class. I think the Wellspring Oracle is the champion in this regards, and it really carries this particular class and archetype high up on the list for me. Most people probably don't like Chaos as much as I do. It might be a lower vote for you, but this is the perfect application of Chaos magic to me, so Wellspring Oracle takes the number 19 spot. At number 18, we have the Elementalist Witch. Now, this is the first time that a class archetype for Witch has shown up, so I'm not going to dive too deep here, but I'm going to say that the Witch and the Witch archetypes overall did very well in this particular ranking. As with the Summoner and the Sorcerer, only some versions of the Witch can actually access the Elementalist archetype. You have to be using a Witch that either has the Arcane spell list or the Primal spell list. And there aren't very many versions of the Witch that come with the Arcane spell list, so for this particular variation, you're largely looking at a class archetype that would apply to a Primal spellcasting Witch. Overall, I love the Witch, I love Witch patrons, I love the lessons that the patrons teach, and I love the design of the Witch class in Pathfinder 2e. The Elementalist Witch carries a lot of those benefits. It's my least favorite Witch archetype, mostly because the Elementalist list is kind of a blaster caster list, and the Witch doesn't feel like a blaster caster to me. It's kind of an odd fit. It's a minor complaint overall. I do love this combination, but at number 18, the Elementalist Witch. So coming in at number 17 on this list, we have a class that ended up doing a lot better than I thought it would. This is a class that I personally am still having a hard time accepting in Pathfinder 2e. I'm coming around slowly, but it's always been a class that feels a little bit off for me. But when I really sat down and thought about the class, and to acknowledge my community yet again, listen to your feedback about this class, I have to say Paizo did a good job here. So for number 17, let's talk about the Bard. The regular old Bard as presented in the core rulebook. This class is extremely well done. One of the most surprising things for me when I was researching this, when I was doing the public polling portion, and I put out the question about who fills their combat role the best. Bard won. The most common class that people put forward as filling its role and filling it properly was the Bard. Now, I don't know if I agree with that assessment personally, But a lot of people said the Bard is supposed to be a team support class. And when you look at the Bard focus spells and the composition cantrips and the different things that Bards get to use, they are a fantastic team buffing class, and they fill the role almost perfectly. And while I still have my hang-ups on Bards and occult magic, I will say that the use of the occult magic tradition is very well done in this system, and Bards are taking one of the best new offerings of Pathfinder 2e and putting it to good effect. Now, me personally, I feel like Bards are still stronger on the social mechanics roleplay side than the combat side. That's just kind of my personal take on it. But I will admit that across the board, Bard performs really well, and Paizo has brought some really good things to the table with the Bard. One of the surprising nuances to the Bard is it may have the best action economy for any casting class in the game. There are a couple of competitors. It's not a clear-cut victory, but when it comes to the best use of actions inside of combat, Bard is definitely top tier among the casters, and I have to acknowledge that Paizo has done a good job here. So for number 16, we have another base class from the core rulebook, and this class also kind of surprised me when I started considering how it actually stacks up against other classes, and that is the baseline Sorcerer. Now, let me go ahead and say, from the earliest days of Pathfinder 2e, I did really like one thing about the baseline Sorcerer, and that was the idea that depending on their bloodline, each Sorcerer has the potential to access any of the 4 magical traditions inside the game. That was a very natural development for the Sorcerer compared to other RPGs. But I feel like Pathfinder 2e is the first game that has really said, let's make the Sorcerer truly open to any path. And that has been a standout aspect of the class since day one. But what I somehow failed to notice is that Sorcerers have the most spell slots of any base class in the game. How did I not see that? For some reason, I completely missed that aspect of the Sorcerer, and when I've evaluated the Sorcerer in the past, they were a lot lower in my evaluation because I just completely missed the incredible number of spells that Sorcerers can fling around. So many thanks to my community for helping me realize this aspect of the class I've overlooked, and also in regards to this community, you all saw the Sorcerer as having very strong role-playing potential, which I definitely agree to. Any class that uses Charisma as its core attribute is already off to a good start, and then the different bloodlines offer a lot of role-playing hooks very naturally, so I feel like Paizo has done a good job here. However, I do stand by one of the small complaints that I've discussed before on this channel, and sadly this isn't really aimed at the Sorcerer, but it affects the Sorcerer, and that is the fact that Sorcerers are no longer the only class that can access any spell tradition. The Witch now can access any spell tradition, the Summoner can now access any spell tradition. What used to set the Sorcerer apart is now becoming more commonplace, and while I understand the Witch and the Summoner and why they also have that aspect to their class, it does steal some of the uniqueness from the Sorcerer, which unfortunately sets the Sorcerer back compared to other more unique and focused classes. Okay, for number 15, we have a very impressive performance by the other current playtest class. That's right, number 15 on my list is the Thaumaturge, and as of the recording of this video, all we have is the playtest version that was presented for the Thaumaturge class. It comes in with an impressive 28 out of 40 for its overall score, and this truly blew my mind. The Thaumaturge was actually mentioned as best in roleplay when I was doing the public feedback portion for this video. Think about that. A playtest class got voted best of in something. That is incredible, and that should tell you exactly why Thaumaturge lands as high on the list as it does. The standout feature for Thaumaturge, and the feature that honestly lends so much to the role-playing side of the class, is the different implements that they offered, and we've already seen some discussion from Paizo about the other implements they intend to use with the final version of the class. Gear can be an aspect of your character that is easy to overlook, even though it is very influential, and here I think that Paizo has done such a fantastic job of making the implements, the gear that the occultist uses, integral in the right way. It doesn't overshadow your character, but it enhances what your character does. And, I'm just now realizing I'm only on number 15 and I am gushing about these classes. This should tell you how good Paizo has done across the board, but in all seriousness, I am rating a playtest class, and it landed number 15 on this list. The rough cut of the Thaumaturge has already delivered some excellent gaming ideas, and I'm definitely excited to see where they go. Now, I will say my wife playtested the Thaumaturge a little bit, and she did find it kind of hard to use. I wouldn't say so hard that it's inaccessible for new players or it's inaccessible for people playing Pathfinder 2e, but there was a learning curve to the playtest Thaumaturge. From the feedback Paizo has given us, I suspect that's going to be better with the final cut of this class, and I am excited to see the differences between the rough cut Thaumaturge and the truly polished Thaumaturge, because, to be honest, a playtest class has no business performing as well as this class did. I am impressed. Number 14 for my list is the Monk, and this is another class that did better than I initially thought it would do. And I'll go ahead and say one of the reasons the Monk scores so high, with an average of 28.5 out of 40, is because the Monk is one of the classes where Paizo has really nailed the class support portion of this ranking video. When I sit down and list the classes that I think Paizo has truly shown the most support for across the whole of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, Monk comes in a solid third in my book. And when you all were voting for longevity and support, the Monk came runner-up in your all's votes as well, which means I think there's a pretty strong sense in this community that Paizo has put in the effort not only to present the Monk well, but to continue to support the Monk, provide options, and find new ways for players to use the Monk inside of the game. Overall, I kind of consider Monk to be a slightly above average class. I like the Pathfinder 2e Monk, but I cut my teeth on the 3.0, 3.5 D&D Monk and all of the crazy Oriental Adventures versions of monks that they had, and it's hard to compete with all of the flavor and craziness that was in those old 3.0, 3.5 books. Pathfinder 2e Monk is good, but maybe this is the nostalgia talking. It just doesn't hold the same weight that some of those older classes did for me. But when I look at the mechanical design of the class, the Monk is very effective. When I look at the support that Paizo gives to the class, they've done a fantastic job of laying lots of options out. And even though the Monk doesn't have true subclasses, which is normally a complaint for me, the different stances that they have included for the Monk kind of fill that slot of subclasses. So overall, this is a very healthy class with a ton of options at its disposal. Now, there is a common complaint that monks have legendary unarmored defense, but they only have master in their unarmed strikes. And I understand the frustration behind that complaint. I am not quite on that bandwagon myself. I understand the game design philosophy that caused Paizo to make that decision for the Monk. And I would even argue that it's the right decision, but I will say that does hurt the class feel to a certain degree. Still, overall, the Monk is effective, it's got a ton of options, it's had an incredible amount of support. I forgot to mention this a moment ago. Monk has support in Secrets of Magic. It has elemental style stances in the back of that book. Monk is not intended to be a caster class, and it has support in the caster book. That is how crazy the support for this class has been. Monk puts up an impressive showing at number 14. Next up is number 13 on my list, which is Champions. They also come in with a respectable 28.5 out of 40 for their overall score, and as a significant nod to the quality of the Champion class in Pathfinder 2e, Champion actually came in third in terms of the number of overall votes received across all 4 categories when I was doing the public discussion portion of the research for this. Champion actually won the public vote for Best of Class Feel, came in runner-up for Combat Role, and had a really good number of votes in the Roleplay category. That is an impressive showing by any measure, and I think it speaks to the quality of the design that Paizo has used for the Champion. First up, let's talk about class role. The Tank. Paladins are the protectors, and Paizo has done a good job of making the Paladin the protector class, the tanking class in Pathfinder 2e. They do it well, and there's a little bit of variation in the different types of champions, but all of them have the ability to protect their party. Also, on the social mechanics, role-playing, and class fantasy or feel side, I have to talk about the edicts, anathema, and tenets of the champion. Paladin is a contentious class. Some people love them, some people hate them. I don't know if Nonat's going to watch this video or not, but Nonat gets real opinionated if a Paladin shows up. And there's a long history of why that happens, but I would just like to say Paizo's design philosophy and how they set up the tenets, the edicts, the anathema, the moral code, if you will, of the champion class is very intelligently done, and I would argue that the champion is the best version of a paladin in any RPG that I have personally seen. I think they nailed that balance to the benefit of the class overall. Really and truthfully, the only thing that kind of hurts the champion's performance in this ranking video is the champion hasn't received the same level of support that some of the other classes in this game have. We started out with the good champions, and then in the Advanced Player's Guide we got the evil champions, which we'll just say is a little bit of a mixed bag. I don't hate that they're in the game, but they're not the most popular, and unfortunately I can kind of see why. And we've never received the neutral champions. So compared to some of the other classes in the game, the champion feels like a class that's not quite finished. Paizo got a good start here, but I would suspect many other members of this community, would like to see more out of the champion because I just don't feel like its potential has been reached yet. So number 12 on this list is another entry that I think may be a little bit controversial to the people who are watching this video. Number 12 is the Fighter, and it comes in with an overall score of 29 out of 40. Now, if you've seen some of my other videos, you know that I'm not the biggest fan of the Fighter personally, and a large portion of that is I really think Paizo made a mistake by not offering subclasses with the Fighter. I'm not the biggest fan of D&D 5e, but if I had to choose between D&D 5e's fighters with distinct subclasses and the generic fighter that Pathfinder 2e offers, I actually prefer the subclasses. I prefer some flavor, some direction for my character. So, if I'm being honest, I didn't want to see the fighter do this well. And here's the weird thing, you all did not want to see the fighter perform well either. When I posted the very first public question about combat role and performance inside of that role, several people said, I don't want to vote for the fighter, and then they went and picked something else. everyone immediately thought of the fighter, but almost everyone immediately said, that's not the vote I want to cast. And I feel like there's some interesting game design implications there. I don't have the time to really dig into this. Fighter is really the only class where I saw this kind of pushback against, here's a very obvious strength of the class, but we don't want to acknowledge it. It's almost like Paizo did something well the wrong way. That's one of the weirdest sentences I think I've said in this video. Now, me personally, I had to give the fighter 10 out of 10 for combat roll, legendary proficiency, and the ability to potentially be legendary proficient in any weapon inside of the game, the incredible variety of feats that the fighter has, not to mention combat flexibility and improved combat flexibility, which may be two of the greatest class features I've ever seen in a game. The fighter does their job and they do it well. I understand the hesitancy that people have, but when I'm trying to be objective, I feel like fighter really takes that spot. And fighter is also one of those classes that does really well in terms of Paizo has supported the class well. I mentioned a moment ago, the fighter has a wide variety of feats, and those feats are really well designed and interesting, and you got a lot of different choices. Paizo has done their homework making the fighter feel like it has real options and real things to contribute. Overall, you all did say that the fighter has a good class feel or class fantasy, and I think the feat design of the fighter plays into that. I still docked the fighter pretty heavily on what I consider to be a complete lack of social mechanics and roleplay hooks, but in all other regards, the fighter is a beast of a class, and I guess it shouldn't surprise me that it landed as high as it did on this list. Okay, so for number 11, I get to talk about a class archetype that I actually feel improves on the base class. And it's the class archetype that I feel like overall has performed the best throughout this list. It is the Wellspring archetype for the Bard. Now, earlier we talked about the Wellspring archetype. You sacrifice some spell slots, but at the start of dangerous or challenging encounters, you have a certain chance of regaining spell slots that you've spent or used. Now, I've already mentioned several of the reasons that the Bard class is such a strong performer, and the Wellspring Bard has all of that. Additionally, the lost spell slots aspect of the Wellspring Bard is offset by the fact that the Bard has a very strong focus spell game. Their compositions and composition cantrips are such a big part of what they are doing that losing some of their spell slots is not as hard of a hit as it would be for a class like the Druid. So the Wellspring Bard is kind of coming into the conversation with all of the advantages that the Bard normally has, plus what I feel is the incredible flavor that the Wellspring archetype brings to the Bard. Now normally when I've discussed the Wellspring archetype, I've talked about chaos magic, and sure, when you talk about bards, you can talk about chaos, but what I actually like in this instance is more the idea of inspiration. Bard is a class that feels like it should be reacting to the moments around it, coming up with new songs, coming up with new jokes, living in the moment, living in the emotion of whatever it is that they see, and the Wellspring archetype is the perfect way to portray that. Sure, bards were already spontaneous spellcasters, but this adds an extra level of spontaneity that I feel like is a perfect fit for the bard and actually improves upon the base bard. The mechanical downsides here are minimal, and the storytelling upsides are incredible, so Wellspring Bard is a very strong class and my pick for number 11. Now we are moving into the top 10. These are the highest performing picks of all of the classes and archetypes I'm talking about in this video, and here's where we're going to begin to see a lot of classes really breaking away from the pack and really distinguishing themselves in one way or another. So let's go with my number 10 pick, which is the Invoker with a total overall score of 29 out of 40. If you're not familiar with the Invoker class, that is the suggested name for the flexible spellcasting archetype when it is applied to the Witch class. In this particular instance, Paizo notes that the Invoker Witch can also be considered a bit of a trickster, and, well, to be honest, I think it's a good fit. Earlier we talked about how the Elementalist Witch felt a little bit off. Witch, as a blaster caster, kind of felt like a bad fit mechanically to what the class is intended to portray. However, the flexible spellcasting archetype for the Witch feels like a very good fit. Witches do feel appropriate to the prepared caster style. They seem the sort who are going to study spell books and plan out the type of magic they want to use, but there's also a trickster element to them. There's also this element of spontaneity that we might associate with the Witch class, and so the flexible spellcasting archetype is a nice way to meet in the middle between those two extremes, and it feels like a very good fit for this class. Now, overall, I will say the baseline Witch appeals to me just a little bit more because they aren't losing spell slots. But I would still be willing to overlook the loss of spell slots for the opportunity to give the Invoker Witch a try, and this is an easy contender for the number 10 spot on my list. So at number 9 on my list, we have a class that achieves a really strong score by being excellent across many categories rather than excelling in particular categories, and that is the standard wizard that comes in the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook. They have a broad, flexible spell list that is designed to be the largest spell list inside the game. The class is very flexible, very versatile. They are good at adjusting to a variety of different situations. And if you've been with this channel for a while, you know I love the way they approach these subclasses for the wizard. Designing the class in such a way that you build your own subclass to really reflect the scholarly nature of the character you are playing. I think Paizo did an incredible job capturing the scholarly feel that the wizard should have, and still making it reasonably interesting for players. But here's the weird thing. You may remember on the Magus I said there were two classes that never got best of votes, they only got runner-up votes. Magus was one, Wizard was the other. That surprised me, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized it's kind of fair. Wizard is a very, very solid class, but I don't know if I consider it exemplary in any particular area of play so much as a class that is just really strong in several areas of play. And I don't have time to chase this rabbit, but I do find it interesting that the Magus and the Wizard, also the only two pure arcane casters in the game, are the two classes that only got runner-up votes. It's as if arcane is strong, but not necessarily anybody's favorite in a particular area. That feels like a topic of another video. I might come back to that. But overall, Wizard is well designed, it's strong, it's flexible, and its massive and constantly growing spell list means that it's going to maintain a very strong position inside of the game and on this list going forward. Okay, so now that I have finished gushing about the Wizard, let's move on to number 8, where I'm going to gush about the Wizard some more and talk about the Arcanist, which is the flexible spellcasting archetype applied to the Wizard class. We've mentioned before that the flexible spellcasting archetype allows a prepared casting class to sacrifice some of their spell slots to gain a semi-spontaneous use of their remaining spell slots. Now, the Arcanist actually used pretty much this model in Pathfinder 1st Edition, and in Pathfinder 1e, the Arcanist was, hands down, my favorite class. When that class was released, I kid you not, I looked at one of our group's GMs and I said, "You should not let me play this class. Can I please play this class?" I loved the Arcanist. It was an amazing experience in Pathfinder 1e, and I was very excited when they brought the flexible spellcasting archetype forward to 2e because I knew it was a concept that I loved. Now, the Arcanist in 2e does take the spell slot hit, and that is significant. However, as I've mentioned, the Playtest Psychic has proven to me that taking the spell slot hit is not game-ending in terms of a class being playable, so I still consider the Arcanist to be very playable, and what makes the Arcanist so powerful is you are taking the Arcane spell list, which is the largest, broadest, most flexible spell list, and giving it the flexibility of prepared casting and the flexibility of spontaneous casting. It is the ultimate magical utility knife. It is, if you love wizards for the reason I love wizards, you understand how beautiful the Arcanist, the flexible spellcasting archetype wizard, truly is. Now, earlier when I talked about the flexible spellcasting cleric, the Ecclesiast, I did say that cleric is the ultimate vehicle if you really love flexible spellcasting, and that is true. I think that the cleric class best highlights what the flexible spellcasting archetype can do. So if you're looking at just that aspect of a class, I still think the Ecclesiast cleric kind of takes that win. But when you look at a class and an archetype complementing one another, I genuinely love what the Arcanist does for the wizard. It takes everything that I love about the base class wizard and just amps it up. Honestly, I could be here all day, but I'm probably not done gushing about the wizard if you've paid attention to Secrets of Magic, so I guess I should keep moving up the list. So at number 7, I want to talk about a class that I feel like has the potential to be top 3 on this list if I revisit it in a couple of years. It is one of the newest classes in the game. From Guns and Gears, let's talk about the Gunslinger with an impressive overall score of 30 out of 40. Gunslinger is a new class, so it didn't have a ton of support when I was doing the public voting. It did get some nods in the combat roles section, but overall the Gunslinger tended to be outshone by other classes or archetypes when you were looking for exemplaries in given categories. Much like the Wizard, the overall quality of the Gunslinger class it's just consistently extremely well done. I mean, one of the disadvantages on this list, at least, that a new class would face is that when you have fewer books, you have fewer opportunities to really vary the kind of things that a class might be able to do. But the Gunslinger comes out with a very impressive selection of subclasses. It comes out with the Spellshot archetype, which I've said is basically a subclass plus in my mind. And it has such an array of interesting gear and such an array of interesting class options that the Gunslinger kind of feels like a class that's been around for a while. The variety of options available to it is incredibly solid. Guns and Gears kind of knocked it out of the park in that regard. In regards to class feel or class fantasy, Gunslinger came in number 2. It narrowly lost out to Alchemist for class fantasy for me. I think Paizo did a fantastic job of nailing what the Gunslinger should feel like in play. And the class is incredibly solid, incredibly strong, contributes really well without feeling overpowered. There were occasions where the first edition Gunslinger didn't feel well balanced against the rest of the game, and I admit the second edition Gunslinger hasn't been around long enough to truly field test it to its fullest extent, but it seems to be off to an incredibly good start, and because of how good the start for the Gunslinger is, I feel like in a couple of years, if I were to revisit this list, and Paizo's had the opportunity to add on top of the incredible array of Gunslinger options already present, I feel like Gunslinger could easily be top 3. Incredible start to a strong class, and it can only go up from here. Moving on to number 6, we have another class from the core rulebook, the Ranger. Ranger has an overall score of 30 out of 40 on this list, and Ranger holds a special place in my heart because my very first AD&D character was actually a Ranger. So it's a class that I've been around for a long time, and it's certainly a concept that I enjoy. In Pathfinder 2e, they have mechanically built the Ranger to be a single target DPS character. You are a hunter. You pick a target and you take that target down with a vengeance, and it's such an appropriate mechanical niche for the Ranger that I'm genuinely surprised I haven't seen it before. It fits so naturally, so well, that it feels like an oversight that I haven't seen it in the past. And on top of that, while there are several options for obtaining animal companions in Pathfinder 2e, they found ways to make the Ranger's animal companion options unique to the class so that if the Ranger is going the animal companion route, they don't feel like they're a carbon copy of another class that also took an animal companion. Paizo did a good job distinguishing Ranger from the other classes and doing that through a mechanical lens. Not just a storytelling lens, not just a particular palette swap, but they actually made the Ranger mechanically distinct in a very fascinating way, and it makes the Ranger a standout class in Pathfinder 2e. Now, Ranger is a little bit weak in the social mechanics and RP category, but it is worth noting that the Outwit option for Rangers can have some pretty powerful implications in a social setting, and that between the single target DPS and the use of Outwit, I actually saw several public votes in both the combat role and RP categories for the Ranger when I put this to a public discussion. So let's just take a moment and appreciate the fact that Paizo has put a beautiful spin on such a classic class. Alright, number 5, we have the highest scoring class archetype in this entire list. Let's talk about the Rune Lord Wizard class archetype. This is a class archetype specifically for wizards. It does not apply to any other class, and it builds off the idea of the specialist wizard. Now, for a regular wizard, you have the option of being a universalist or specializing in one of the 8 schools of magic, such as abjuration, conjuration, or enchantment. There are certain benefits that are associated with specializing in a school of magic, but some people dare to ask, what if you pushed that specialization further? What if you drove yourself to the mastery of a particular school of magic at the expense of your ability to access other schools of magic? That is where the Rune Lord class archetype comes in, and if you have played other editions of fantasy RPGs, you will quickly realize this is the old school specialist wizard. That's what Paizo did here. In older editions of this game, if you wanted to specialize in a school of magic, you weren't just hindered with some schools, you were actively prohibited from using certain schools of magic at all. It was a pretty brutal restriction. And I remember playing the old school specialist wizards, and I remember loving the old school specialist wizards. I know of maybe 2 other people that preferred a specialist wizard to a universalist wizard in previous editions of the game. Specialist wizard was hard to play, but if you knew how to do it and knew how to do it right, it was so much fun. And Paizo found a way through class archetypes to replicate that old school feel to specialist magic by literally making it old school in their setting. The Rune Lord is a reference to the Rune Lords of Thassalon, which is an ancient society ruled by wizards in the Golarion setting. So their old school magic is literally an old school of mages in their setting. It's a flavor win, it's a mechanics win, it is a perfect throwback to old school gaming, and I absolutely applaud Paizo for how they pull off the Rune Lord class archetype. This is, in my opinion, the best archetype in this game. There are some core classes that are higher, but I love this. And I really should stop gushing about wizards. I've been doing it too much in the top 10. Rune Lords, good choice. Alright, number 4. We're getting to the top. Let's talk about the class that would take the win if we were voting solely based on spells that they can access at level 20. That is the Druid with an overall score of 30 out of 40. Kaiju form. Summon Kaiju. This is what level 10 spells are supposed to look like. They are some of the most hilarious, amazing, overpowered, madness-inducing spells in the game. I love them. Druids get them. This is what a level 20 spellcaster should be doing. If I was going purely off high-level spell choices alone, Druid would take the cake in this regard. But that is far from the only good thing about the Druid. Druids come with some excellent subclass design in the various orders that they have available to them. I would like to see some more orders. I feel like there's still some concepts with the Druid that they haven't explored yet, but I do appreciate the orders that Paizo has given us. And overall, Druids have seen pretty consistent support from Paizo in terms of offering new spells, new orders, new options that a Druid player can use. In fact, in the public voting, you all chose Druid as the most supported class by Paizo. There's a class that I personally believe is a little bit better, but I can definitely say Paizo has done a good job of making sure that Druids have a wealth of options available to them. If there's anything that's keeping the Druid down from being in the top 3 here, it is the social side of the Druid's game. While there is some good RP potential here, this is not the most socially focused class inside the game, and that does hinder its overall score a little bit, but the Pathfinder 2e design for Druid is top-notch and easily deserving of the number 4 spot on this list. Now it's on to the top 3. The creme de la creme of this list, the classes that have the best overall performance across all 4 categories that we are discussing here today. For number 3, we're talking about what is probably my favorite class in Pathfinder 2e, and the last non-core rulebook class on this list, the Witch from the Advanced Player's Guide. Now, up until this point, we have talked about the archetyped versions of the Witch that are available through Secrets of Magic, but up until this point we haven't discussed the base class. And the base class for the Witch it's top-notch. If you've seen me on this channel, you know that I love the way the Witch is constructed. Pathfinder 1e Witch was strong, but I never connected to the flavor of that class. It just never appealed to me. The patrons in Pathfinder 1e felt as bland as the cleric domains in Pathfinder 2e. Ow, that was mean, Mark. That was real mean. But in Pathfinder 2e, they have fleshed out patrons in a very intelligent way, first and foremost by allowing the patrons to change what tradition of magic you can even use. And then they have fleshed out your patrons and the role-playing potential of your patrons through the concept of lessons that your character learns from your patron. And this is to say nothing of the incredible familiar rules that Pathfinder 2e has. I feel kind of bad, I haven't discussed familiars once in this entire list, but we'll go ahead and say here that the familiar rules are incredible, flexible, they are very user-friendly, and they allow for incredible variety, and the class that can push the familiar the furthest is the Witch. So, across a lot of different areas, the Witch comes in as a top-tier contender. And in the public voting on the different classes and different categories, the Witch was the single most mentioned class. It got the most votes for social mechanics and RP hooks. It won overall votes. It got votes in longevity and support. It got votes in class feel and fantasy. Like many of the casting classes in this game, it didn't do well in the combat vote, but time and again, I saw you all voting for the Witch and mentioning the Witch as one of the most well-done classes in this game. If there is a single complaint about the Witch, it's that I want to see more. I want more patrons. I want more lessons. I really want more lessons. I want to see more options for the Witch and their subclass design, because Paizo is hit on a gold mine here. There's a ton of potential, and the only fault with the Witch is that it hasn't quite reached its true potential yet. So, we're down to the last two. And if you've been keeping track, you probably know which two remain in contention here. So the real question is, of the last two remaining classes, who's going to take runner-up and who's going to take the grand prize overall? Well, number 2 on my list is the Barbarian, with an impressive score of 33 out of 40. The Barbarian got a lot of votes from you all, especially in the combat role, and I think there is no denying that the Barbarian is a powerhouse class. It is accessible, understandable, and very effective. If I were sorting this list solely by names of feats for a given class, Barbarian would take number 1 because the friendly toss feat is the funniest feat in this entire game, hands down. I love that. But there are several things that I really think make the Barbarian stand out. And one of them is, this is the class that Paizo really could have phoned in, but they didn't. Barbarian is a relatively simple concept, mechanically and in terms of story. Paizo could have produced a very basic Barbarian, and the gaming community would not have noticed. It would have flown right under our radar. But Paizo didn't do that. They took the time to create and describe some of the best subclasses I have ever seen in a role-playing game. I am not sure if number 1 on this list or the Barbarian has better subclasses. It's really a toss-up between the two, but just the statement that Barbarian is in the running for best subclass design in an RPG is mind-blowing to me. One of the subclasses is the Fury subclass, which is literally the subclass of, I don't need a subclass, I'm here to hit things. Like I said, Paizo could have phoned this in. But we get things like the Animal Instinct Barbarian with numerous different animal options to give you multiple flavors of an animalistic barbarian. You get the Dragon Instinct Barbarian, which could be a dragon servant or a dragon slayer. Remember earlier where I talked about anathema and edicts for the champion? Yeah, barbarians get those too, and again, they are very well designed. You can take the Dragon Instinct Barbarian and using the same mechanical package, apply 2 different sets of edicts and anathema and create 2 very different feeling characters. That's impressive. I will admit I'm not the biggest fan of the Superstition Instinct Barbarian. It feels okay, but I'm not sure if I wanted it in the game. But overall, the fact that Paizo went so far above and beyond in making the Barbarian a class that has interesting, meaningful choices is just absolutely impressive, and Barbarian is easily number 2 on this list. If Paizo were to drop a few more interesting subclass options for the Barbarian, like say a Blood Rager, hint hint Paizo, I could easily see Barbarian taking the number 1 spot. And now we come to number 1. And honestly, I can't bury the lead here, because if you're running a checklist, you already know who number 1 is. It's the Rogue. The Rogue comes in with an impressive score of 34 out of 40. It takes the number 1 spot with a perfect 10 out of 10 score in the longevity and support category for this video. And the public voting and discussion of the Rogue saw incredible support for the Rogue in combat, role-playing, and longevity. So I know that my overall impression of the Rogue matches what the community feels about the Rogue as well. Paizo has done a good job across the board, making the Rogue one of the best play experiences in the entire game. In some of my other videos, I've noted that the Rogue is actually one of the most new player-friendly classes I've ever seen. By choosing to make the Rogue a skill monkey class, they have allowed new players to pick up a character that will make their most important decisions in a style of play that is naturally a little slower paced, meaning it's a little bit easier for a new player to adapt to the role that they've chosen for the group. Inside of combat, the rogue strategy is reasonably easy to figure out, but not terribly hard to implement, and a new player can pick it up very quickly. On top of that, starting around level 10, rogues get incredible abilities called debilitations that they can add to their sneak attack that make them a powerful debuffer against the enemy. In other words, time and time again, rogue just brings so much to the table. Their role in combat is clear, easy to use, very effective. Their social options are varied, but again, pretty easy to implement. And the class feel or class fantasy is pretty much on point for this class. On top of that, rogues come with one of the widest feat selections in the game. I feel like fighter and monk edged them out by just a hair, but given the amount of options that rogues have in the skill and skill feat department, I don't begrudge that tiny difference, and really I'm just impressed by how much the rogues have access to. And then, rogues are a contender for best subclasses. Again, I'm not sure if they beat the Barbarian or not in this regard, but can we take a moment to recognize that all of the rogue subclasses are extremely well done? You have a subclass for the strength-based rogue, you have a subclass for the dex-based rogue, you have the mastermind subclass if you want to play Moriarty, you have the charisma-based subclass if you want to play the Han Solo-style scoundrel, and then you have the Eldritch Trickster, which gives the rogue access to any possible spellcasting option in the game. I usually don't get into edition wars, but I just want to go ahead and say this. D&D 5e Arcane Trickster versus Pathfinder 2e Eldritch Trickster, Pathfinder wins, hands down, not even a competition. Paizo nailed the Eldritch Trickster subclass. So well done. There really isn't a portion of the rogue where I feel disappointed by the options available in combat, in roleplay, in character development. From level 1 to level 20, the rogue is consistently a top-tier performer. And you may remember near the beginning of this video, how many years ago was that? That I actually said, I am biased against rogues. I typically do not like rogues inside of RPGs, but I love the Pathfinder 2e rogue, and Paizo has made this a standout class that truly sets itself apart from the rest. Number 1, best class overall, at least for now, Pathfinder 2e's rogue. And that's my list. That is how I currently rank all 40 class and class archetypes in Pathfinder 2e. Now, as more books come out, as Paizo continues to expand the system and the options that are available to us, I'm sure that these rankings are going to change. And in a couple of years, I might actually revisit this list and see where different classes are in comparison to where they are right now. In the meantime, let me turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about this list? I know this was a huge conversation. Happy New Year. Let me know where you agree, where you disagree, and what classes you feel deserved more respect, or maybe got weighed a little too highly in my evaluation. I expect at least 20 comments telling me I still didn't give the Investigator a fair shake. Don't disappoint me, Internet. But I encourage you, be part of the conversation, and let me know if some of the larger picture conversation elements that I added to this were interesting to you. It was fun not only examining the nuance of each class, but also seeing kind of the bigger picture of where classes and class archetypes might fall as I was going through this list. I think that we have discovered several possible threads of conversation, and I would be interested in hearing which conversations you would like to have in the future. Now, don't worry, next video is not going to be nearly this long, but if you enjoyed this video, thank you for sticking around as long as you have. Like the video and share it, subscribe to the channel. You can check out my Discord and my Patreon, which are linked in the video description below. Thank you so much for being here, and have a wonderful day.